Hi, everyone. It's good to have you with us tonight. Welcome to the Tocqueville Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Ben Gross at Jacksonville State University, and I appreciate you joining us tonight. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is named after Alexis de Tocqueville. Born of the French aristocracy, Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that liberal ideas, which rejected both the antiquity of aristocracy and doubted the promise of the French Revolution, were the progression of history. Whether individuals fought for or against these ideals, he was convinced that equality of conditions is a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as they relate to other concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. These are free public lectures which promote the campus of Jacksonville State University, other institutions of learning, and their surrounding community to come together to listen, think, reflect, and engage with each other. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by a generous grant from the Jack Miller Center. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions, which continue to animate our national life. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce to you Dr. Andrea Radasanu. Dr. Andrea Radasanu is an associate professor of political science and director of the University Honors Program at Northern Illinois University. She is also the founder and chief editor of Compass, an undergraduate journal of American political ideas. I strongly suggest that after this presentation, not during this presentation, but after this presentation, that everyone take a look at the excellent publications at Compass. They include things like examinations of hate speech laws, the relationship between democracy and anxiety, gerrymandering, Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, and more. Dr. Radasanu has published numerous articles in journals such as the History of Political Thought, Political Research Quarterly, and Perspectives on Political Science. She has also authored numerous chapters that were published by Lexington, Rutledge, and Pennsylvania State University Press. In addition, she has taught courses on political philosophy, just war theory, democratic theory, Montesquieu, Thucydides, and more. Dr. Radasanu has been honored with numerous awards. These include, but are not limited to, the Sharon Howard Women Who Make a Difference Award, the Northern Illinois University Honors Great Professor Award, and the Outstanding Teacher in Political Science Award from Pi Sigma Alpha. I could continue to share all the excellent experiences, activities, publications, and honors that Dr. Radasanu possesses, but I will restrain myself at this point because I know we aren't here for that. We're here for a great presentation and a great Q&A. Now, while we may not all be in the same room with each other, I hope you will join in with me in welcoming Dr. Radasanu to our campus. Thank you very much for being here, Dr. Radasanu.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Let me
I sound like an old person, but you can hear me, right?
hold on one second, Dr. Radasanu. We will get you. Let me get you into our content. And there you are. You are live now.
Okay. Hi. Hello, everybody. Thank you for that. I am going to share. Just make sure that I can share my PowerPoint before I begin. We're all set?
I
think we're good.
We're all set. Whenever you want me, just let me know. I'll send it live.
Oh, okay. Yep. I think go right ahead. Just let me know when it's safe to begin.
You're all good.
All good. Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Even though I can't see you, I'm assured that the technology is broadcasting me as well as my PowerPoint to you. And it's a real pleasure to be here today, even remotely. And I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your evenings to come here and hear me talk about Montesquieu on war and peace and international relations. I want to thank Dr. Gross, especially for this invitation and also his very, very kind introduction. I appreciate that. I first met Ben. I get to call him Ben because I met him as an undergrad. in an honor seminar, which I still teach, and it's called War, Empire, and Ethics. Much of my research on the topic of war and peace has its genesis in teaching that course. At that time, I was an assistant professor in political science, and as he mentioned, I'm still here and I'm tenured, and I'm the director of that honors program in which I met him all those years ago. And of course, Ben has come a long way. He's gotten his own doctorate, and he had the bad judgment to become a colleague in political theory. I don't know, I suppose I should take a little tiny bit of blame for that, but he's doing his own great work and great teaching and his own great, fantastic contributions to the community. So anyway, I'm very grateful for his friendship and for, again, for having me here today. And I also wanted to shout out to the Jack Miller Center. I know Ben gave him a proper introduction, but I too thank them for funding the series and for funding all sorts of things, like they funded a complete revamp, for example, of the Compass undergrad journal that Ben mentioned. So, as I said, I'm going to talk to you about Montesquieu's views on war and peace. The really fancy title that you have before you on the screen, that's the paper that arises out of this. I'm going to be a little less formal than all of that would suggest up there. So I hope that the talk will bring, Montesquieu to life a little bit. Ben has shared that you guys haven't had a ton of Montesquieu at JSU, so hopefully I will whet your appetites to learn more and his to teach more of it. And I hope that I can demonstrate how rewarding it is to read carefully works that are in fact written carefully and that are complex. I also hope we'll be able to think a little bit about big topics in international relations while we're at it. I will use my PowerPoint somewhat sparingly, so it's not going to be the case that, everything I say will be on the PowerPoint. I'm mainly using it to highlight special passages for the parts of the talk where I'm focusing on specific excerpts of his work. So I won't be using it to sort of outline an argument or anything like that. So, because, well, I think that just makes it so that, it's hard to listen, I think, weirdly enough, when everything's also said. Okay, let me just move that along to our next, speaking of the slides. So I thought, though, again, since, Montesquieu may be a fresh face, long dead, of course, but a fresh face nonetheless to us in this proverbial room. I just thought I would, just introduce him in the briefest of terms, just to give you some sense, and you can see on your screen of, when did he live, where was he from? You can see from his title that he's a nobleman. And actually, it's pretty fitting that he be presented in a Tocquevillian setting. Tocqueville was really affected by what Montesquieu wrote, and both of them were noblemen that were living through some really major changes and saying some very important things about them. He wrote a lot of things. If you know anything about what he wrote, you may know Spirit of the Laws. I list 3 key works that he has there. Spirit of the Laws, again, is the last one, is the most comprehensive of his works. All of those are pretty important, and I draw on all of them, maybe especially Spirit of the Laws and the considerations on the causes of the greatness of the Romans and their decline. Just a little pitch that, he's super significant for American political thought, especially for the founding generation. And it didn't matter if you were on the Federalist side or the anti-Federalist side, everybody found something to love in Montesquieu. I think, if anything, one can remember him for advocating on behalf of sort of modern liberty, liberty of the individual, and the importance of the separation of powers, from government oppression, all the while still expecting government to be strong enough to provide order and security. So these sorts of ideas and concerns that he had were really significant. Also, and this pitches me into my subject a little bit more. It really isn't an overstatement to call Montesquieu the most important figure of the French Enlightenment. So notice his dates. He's born like at the tail end of Louis XIV's reign. He lives through the French Restoration and is 30 years or 20 or so years off. 30. My math was better the first time. The French Revolution. So he hasn't seen what's to come. He's still in the what we would call the Ancien Regime, and he's sort of in the flowering of the French Enlightenment. And actually, that work, the Persian Letters that you see in among his key works, that was published in 1721, and it's very widely considered to be the opening salvo of the French Enlightenment, and probably its most important work. So he wrote lots. He was extremely well read and important to the French, as I said, he was later to the Americans also. But that doesn't mean he isn't difficult to read, and that doesn't mean that there isn't still quite a lot to learn. You'd think if somebody's been read for the last 300 years and was widely read in his own time, we could just go ahead and read them and everything kind of works out. But as it happens, you can write a book that's 600 pages long, be very influential on it, and still leave a lot of room for interpretation and going. And the more you read it, the more you realize, goodness, what exactly did that mean? I'm going to try to demonstrate that with what he says about commerce in a second. And while I have studied, many of the subjects that Montesquieu discusses, I have spent the most amount of time on his views on war and peace. Now, having said that Montesquieu was an extremely influential figure of the French Enlightenment, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's good on all topics or that you want to hear him on all topics, or in this case, on war and peace, right? I mean, what does an 18th century Ancien Regime pre-French Revolution figure have to teach us about international relations? Surely everything has changed, between then and now. Can I really make the claim that it's interesting beyond a kind of historical exercise to look at this sort of stuff? Now, I'm sure you're suspicious of me already. I'm a political philosophy professor, and I make a living studying 18th to 19th century thought. So of course I think somehow this is important, and I defend long dead thinkers all the time. But let me give you I'll give you a couple of reasons why I think we need to take them somewhat seriously on this topic and others. One, I think the 18th century, and it's not the only century, but the 18th century holds particular interest to us. It is, the Enlightenment continues to provide us with insights that still matter, in part because a lot of the political language and ideas that we still use, such as, for example, natural rights, still have a lot of currency with us today. So a lot of our language comes from that era. And in the specific case of the subject of war and peace or international relations, Montesquieu gives rise to the idea that still has lots of prevalence, and that is the concept of commercial peace. Let me move on to my next slide for that. So I don't know if you've come across this, and certainly we don't want to get into the weeds of this, but this is the idea, in, again, the simplest of terms, the most general of terms, that nations that conduct business with one another tend not to go to war with one another. And there's an entire cottage industry in international relations that posits a related premise, which I also have up there, the democratic peace. So the phenomenon that these sort of mostly international relations scholars are trying to explain is the seeming peace between liberal democratic states. So in short, can you picture Canada and the US at war with one another over a dispute? Please, Ben did not mention that I am a Canadian, but I'm also an American. But don't let that fool you, and I'm aware of the War of 1812. But in general, just picture America and Canada getting into a large enough dispute over, whatever it is, whatever NAFTA disagreement we may have, and that leads to, tanks at the border. If that seems kind of insane and totally outlandish, the question is why, and there have been a lot of answers given to this. Is it the democratic norms and institutions that align democratic countries to sort of peaceful disputes? This is something like what Immanuel Kant would have argued just a little bit after Montesquieu. But the commercial peace is another popular hypothesis, right? It isn't, and that one would sort of be something like this, right? It isn't that important that liberal democracies are democracies. What's more important is that they embrace commerce and trade, and that facilitates sort of peaceful transactions among them. So there's much to unpack with all of these claims, and I think the people sort of tend to think, or thinkers and scholars now tend to think, that there's something to the phenomenon that's being observed, but there's a lot of disagreement about why it happens. Now, what's interesting for us here today is that the idea of the commercial peace comes up in the 18th century, comes up through Montesquieu, and oddly enough, comes up at a time when liberal democracies really didn't even exist for the most part, not in any sense that we would agree that that they have electoral systems, that we would sort of check them off the list as liberal democracies. England was probably the closest to this, and Montesquieu uses England as the model both of separation of powers and a commercial nation. So there was something like that, but it wasn't the case that it lived in among lots of other liberal democracies, and itself it probably wasn't quite that. But with Montesquieu, you have the idea that commerce is going to make things more peaceful, and that comes with a lot of interesting sort of ideas that come from it. Now, it's not that he was the only one to talk about it, but he was probably the first. He wrote before Adam Smith, for example, and one of the neat things about kind of getting an idea at its source is that it tends to be sort of really deep and really interesting. So let me show you some of their famous things he says about this to get us moving. So if you are brave and want to read into Spirit of Laws and you make it all the way to book 20, you will be rewarded with an entire book on commerce. Now, in front of you, those are three of them. He says many other things about commerce, but these are like the three basic claims about the pacifying effects of commerce. So I think it's just worthwhile to get those into our brains as we consider, as I build to where this is going. All right, so the natural effect of commerce is to lead to peace. Two nations that trade with each other become reciprocally dependent. If one has an interest in buying, the other has an interest in selling, and all unions are founded on mutual needs. I mean, it doesn't bring a tear to the eye, but we get the point. Now, it gets weirder if you're not familiar with him. Commerce cures destructive prejudices, and it is an almost general rule that everywhere there are gentle mores, there is commerce, and that everywhere there is commerce, there are gentle mores. Finally, commerce, I know there's another one, but finally, from 21, commerce has spread knowledge of the mores of nations everywhere, and Ben's face is exactly where I'm trying to read that. Commerce has spread knowledge of the mores of nations everywhere. They have been compared to each other, and good things have resulted from this. So, there's a lot here. I've written whole papers on literally these three sentences, and that isn't what I want to do here exactly. But you can see that you can spin out a lot of possible explanations here. The last thing that I do have on there is from a different book, European. Sometimes he makes grandiose statements, Europe is one great republic, everything's amazing. Now, if you read around those statements, it tends to be a little bit like it doesn't sound quite as grandiose and quite as, so who is this guy, Montesquieu? Does he really think that commerce is going to bring like everlasting peace and that we're not going to go to war, or that we can't have wars about commerce, and on and on, and what exactly, so how much gentleness does he believe is going to come about? And and there have been different ways of interpreting this. A lot of folks sort of don't read a lot of progressive sort of idealism into this, and some do. It's worth noting that in the 18th century, you did have the likes of, I mentioned Immanuel Kant, but there was a much earlier figure, Abbé Saint-Pierre. Well, not really, actually, right around the same time. So there were people who kind of posited, if Europe could only be a confederacy, we can kind of have like a European Union where you would join together and you would become one great happy nation, and there would be no more war, and terms like perpetual peace were born in each of these cases. So where does Montesquieu fit into this? Some have suggested that he has a similar point of view, drawing on these very statements that we just read out. That's really similar to what he wants, but he has a kind of really idealistic view as to what merchants might be able to bring. That you can somehow supersede sovereignty of nations and come up with like a brand new kind of trading universe where everybody gets along. In my previous work on this topic, and I understand that a few of Dr. Gross's students on this call may have read my article in Political Research Quarterly, I took on this question, is Montesquieu a Pollyanna when it comes to his grand hopes for peace and international relations, founded on an overwhelming faith in the pacifying powers of commerce? So my answer has been simple. No, I don't believe that this is the case. If Montesquieu is an apostle of progress through enlightenment, it isn't primarily because human beings become more virtuous. It's not what he means by the destruction of harmful prejudices, but that's a whole other topic. If anything, it's because they let go of illusions regarding nobility, which are destructive prejudices actually, and embrace the transactional morality of the merchant class. As we were talking about, Montesquieu himself is a member of the French aristocracy, but he sensed the winds of change, the rise of the bourgeoisie, and ultimately embraced the shift, warts and all. The quotations provided here tell the story. Here, let me show you the next set. So just for one, I just wanted to highlight and I made a crack about this, but unions are founded on mutual needs. I think this is the key. That's it. For all the fancy words and the pretty kind of sentiments, it's ultimately that he is depending upon to bring a kind of resolution to certain sorts of conflicts. Here's the next one, and this is taken from, you can see it's from 20.2 in Spirit of Laws. What I mean to say is, like, the next line and a couple of the prettier statements, you end up with this statement. He says, but if the spirit of commerce unites nations, it does not unite individuals in the same way. We see that countries where one is affected only by the spirit of commerce, there is traffic in all human activities and all moral virtues. The smallest things, those required by humanity, are done or given for money. See, that doesn't sound so nice, right? And I mean, there have been some who've read this as a criticism. I mean, they've taken this to mean that he isn't, quite the opposite of those who think he's idealistic and wants, commerce to transform things and make people more, progress in all ways. They actually do focus on this, and when they do, they can't believe that the person who says this about commerce and how it makes people, not do anything unless they're going to be rewarded for it, can sound like a a good thing or something that he would be behind. But I think he probably, again, he understands that there's an ugly side to commerce, but first of all, it's a coming, but it's also the case that it probably, he'll take its benefits and accept its limitations. But clearly, he's not counting on people being nicer or more altruistic for any of this to come about. And another thing to clarify, his rosy statements about commerce, the first, which if they were rosy, it was the first batch, is that in them he sort of exaggerates the extent to which his age had fully embraced commerce. He does say that war had become an outmoded way for nations to compete elsewhere. He doesn't really bring it into this statement, but he also stresses that modern Europe had an increasing appetite for war and empire, despite the great economic costs of war and the diminishing returns he argues accrued from modern warfare. So what you have is somebody who's saying these like fantastic sort of commerce is going to bring an end to war, and elsewhere making it very clear he understands that that's not where we're at. I mean, again, you've got England, but then you've got other problems. In the very recent rearview mirror, he had Louis XIV, or the Sun King, whose dreams of universal empire led to a massive debt problem in France. Tell me if that sounds familiar. And aided and abetted the increasing centralization of government, which he detested, and the growth of expensive standing army, all for the sake of appeasing the king's appetite for power and glory, and to try to outshine the Roman attempt at universal monarchy. So it wasn't the case that Montesquieu thought that modernity had it all figured out, but there was the example of England and its commitment to commerce and the profit motive above all else, which put it on track for accumulating real power, as opposed to following outdated models for ancient glory, to the detriment even for those who succeeded in that way. So he's saying, look, France, you're addicted to glory, you're addicted to all of these sort of ancient models, and it doesn't lead to real power, it doesn't lead to real success. England's the way, and again, that was exactly what happened. France was not to have real power it absolutely started losing ground to England for exactly the reasons that Montesquieu gave. So if war was outmoded, it still held sway, like we're talking about, and as did the visions of grandeur of increasingly powerful European despots. So commerce among nations was aspirational, not a done deal. And even though he thought the writing was on the wall, his own work represents an effort to persuade modernity to overcome its lingering fetish for the past. But to the degree that commerce was going to be a way forward, the progress would not be a matter of improved morality or a more altruistic worldview or a permanent Congress of Nations. It would be the somewhat more orderly competition through commerce that would replace the destruction that war generally wrought, according to him. While I have put this understanding of Montesquieu's view of the role of commerce in pacifying international relations in print and stand by it, I soon figured out that Montesquieu also offers some really important insights into the possibilities and limits of international law, which is the paper that I'm currently finishing and that this talk sort of gets to. So let me tell you the story of how I came to see his insights on the problems of international law with the rest of what I have to say. So if I had come to see Montesquieu's reliance on commerce as a hard-headed and realist, and all progress he bets on a kind of utility and reciprocal benefit, he does make some other sorts of statements that lead one in a different direction. So let me read you one of these, which is like the most important to me, that really led me down a garden path here. Okay. So I'll get to what all of this means in a second, but let me read it to you. He says, where the law of nations or like the right of conquest, all of these sorts of ideas, where those are concerned, he says, here, homage must be paid to our modern times, to contemporary reasoning, to the religion of the present day, to our philosophy and our mores. All right, now we're in a completely different part of the book. We're in book 10, and this is where he talks about offensive force. But, you know, it's pretty clear. He's saying he thinks there's been progress in mores, and that there's, you know, there's an ethos of the moderns that's an improvement over that of the ancients. And I, you know, where's commerce then? To, you know, I put all my hopes, all the pacification comments, all thoughts that I've had that I've understood come from commerce, not from any of this stuff, right? So this is something else. But it turns out that it's a much more complicated story that he tells. He says this, but the context is important. Like, taken on its own, though, it basically says that Christianity, philosophy, and the contemporary way of life, those are the things that make, you know, that make pacification. And again, what is the relationship between commerce and mutual interest on the one hand, and the seemingly smug opinion that there's just been wonderful progress all along the way and everything's fine? Now, a lot rides on this question, and not just that I would have been wrong in PRQ, and that would suck, right? It would definitely mean that he's not just a hard-headed realist, how I've you know, how I presented him. You know, the other thing is that I'm not sure that he would be as worth reading as I had presented, right? What if he is just a guy who just has this conventional belief that everything that Europe wrought was good? And, you know, it doesn't matter how commerce fit together. He didn't even ask himself potentially how commerce fit together with these statements. You know, does he have a kind of smug superiority and even a shallowness, you know, in terms of like, how do these things go together? I mean, you know, how does Christianity, just on the face of it, how does Christianity and modern philosophy go together? You know, I know you guys spend some time with Bacon and, I don't know, Spinoza maybe, and Hobbes, all these guys. They would have something to say about whether, you know, there's a real kinship between Christianity and modern philosophy. And but you know, if you read the book, Montesquieu's book, Spirit of Laws, you do start to see that, you know, this can't possibly be the case. I mean, he, you know, his account of commerce is, I mean, if I could just be brief about it, is fairly anti-Christian, right? Christianity stood in opposition to commercial mores, and he says he wants to return commerce to a place of good repute and not have it be shunned, you know, as greedy and soulless. So, you know, with that, armed with that sort of knowledge that this can't be this whole story, it's not the whole story. You know, I think often he imitates that sort of the philosophe class, the 18th century, you know, kind of the pedant, the one who knows all these things and just kind of pulls them out in French culture, you know, as intellectual trends go. But Montesquieu is fancier. Let me show you the context. This is a little bit of a longer one. So here's the context. He delivered that seemingly naive affirmation of the gentling effects of religion, mores, philosophy, and so forth, in the context of his statements regarding conquest. He begins that chapter by saying the right of war derives, it's not on your screen, but the right of war derives that of conquest, which is its consequence. Therefore, it should follow in the spirit of the former. And then he proceeds with two lists. This is the second one. I won't go through the first one, but the first one, it's all is about the rights of the conqueror and what kind of laws pertain to the right of conquest. And the second is this. These are 4 different ways in which conquerors treat the conquered. One state that has conquered another treats it in one of these four ways. The state continues to govern its conquest according to its own laws and takes for itself only the exercise of political and civil government. 2, it gives its conquest a new political and civil government. 3, it destroys the society and scatters it into others, or finally it exterminates all of its citizens. So yeah, gentle to not so gentle, I guess, right? He goes on, the first way conforms with the right of nations we follow at present. The fourth is more in conformity with the right of nations among the Romans. We are gentle. We just let people have their laws, which is very nice. The Romans are mean and they enslave and exterminate people. It's very simple, very okay. And now in this is where he inserts that statement. We can, all of that progress in terms of right of nations. Okay. Great, sounds fantastic, except we go on. I have to move Ben again on my screen. So that's what happens when I have to pay for giving you such long things. Okay. The very next line after that, Montesquieu criticizes our contemporary public law. I mean, it's not, you have to go to another part of the book. You don't have to go to a different book. It just goes as if you haven't noticed. For justifying the enslavement and even the extermination of conquered people. So this happens immediately after, when the authors of our public right, for whom ancient histories provided the foundation. Now, wait a minute. What's the difference between the ancients and the moderns? If the moderns are founding themselves on ancients, and they do, is it when they're following and where they're not following that they exterminate people? Anyway, when the authors of our public right, for whom ancient histories provided the foundation, have no longer followed cases strictly, they have fallen into great errors. They have moved toward the arbitrary. They have assumed among conquerors a right, I do not know which one, of killing. This has made them draw consequences as terrible as this principle and establish maxims that the conquerors themselves, when they had the slightest sense, never adopted. So what on earth is happening? This great praise turns into a big rebuke. It's no longer clear who's good, who's bad, should they be following ancient practices or ancient historians, or what is going on? And do laws or rules of war do anybody any good, regardless whether they're old or new? So, I mean, I left, having kind of read this for, you read something 20 times and then the 21st time, for some reason, it just kind of dawns on you that there's an issue here, and you leave very, very confused. I mean, we can begin by noting, the sobering thought that atrocities are possible among modern and supposedly enlightened nations, just as they were among the ancients. That seems indisputable. Even worse, though, it's not that human beings transgress norms, it's that they seek to justify these transgressions. And this is where we sort of come around to the problem with international law. And what he means by the authors of our public law up there are those philosophers, he never says, but he put a bunch of stuff together. But these are philosophers or men of letters who tried to provide some scope for what is permissible or according to natural law. Hugo Grotius is probably first on his list, who wrote in the 17th century, and he's often taken to be the father of modern international law. His work is a kind of compendium of laws of nations, which often rely on Roman law. So there isn't a big distinction if you start to think about it. You kind of pick through who he might have in mind, and you realize that, yeah, okay. He could well be who he has in mind here. He supposedly lays out the limits of just law, but ultimately justifies the law of the stronger, including providing a Roman justification for the enslavement of the conquered. If you look through, he does provide that. So that's probably what's going on here. There's a character in the Persian letters called Uzbek who jokes that European international law explains to kings how far they can violate justice without damaging their own interests. So if you think he's not capable of this sort of humor because the spirit of law sounds boring, you can find this stuff. So to obtain full confirmation that Montesquieu isn't impressed with the gentleness of modern war and its supposedly enlightened digest of laws or norms, we need to consider his treatment of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, which will bring us around to Montezuma sooner or later. While this occurred hundreds of years before Montesquieu was writing, and it was not Grotius, because he hadn't written yet, but Vittoria, who provided the kind of just word justification of enslavement of the conquered in that case, it was still very much a touchstone of the harmfulness of conquest for Montesquieu and other Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century. After Montesquieu provides his withering comments regarding the failings of modern jurists here and the ease with which atrocities are justified, he moves on to the Spanish conquest example. Again, with tongue firmly planted in cheek, he follows the chapter we just discussed, that's just up here on your screen, with one entitled Some Advantages for the Conquered People. Yeah, starting to see he has a sense of humor. The only example he provides of the great advantages one might have from being conquered is an instant in which nothing good comes of the conquest. Here's how he puts it. A conquest can destroy harmful prejudices and, if I dare speak in this way, can put a nation under a better presiding genius. What good could the Spanish not have done the Mexicans? They had a gentle religion to give them. They brought them a raging superstition. They could have set the slaves free, and they made free men slaves. They could have made clear to them that human sacrifice was an abuse. Instead, they exterminated them. I would never finish if I wanted to tell all the good things they did not do and all the evil ones that they did. Ouch. But while this indictment of the Spanish conquest is scathing, it still seems to provide an opening for civilizing missions that might work, that might provide an improved way of life for the conquered. He preserves, at least for a moment, the possibility that modern religion and so on might be more just. And note that he alludes to one of Christianity's chief accomplishments in international right, the outlawing of slavery, which is true. Maybe then Montesquieu does believe in a right of nations that comes from a joint Roman and Christian tradition, as amended by natural modern right that Grotius also embodies. Yet the evidence that Montesquieu provides throughout the course of the work does not, we just can't find that. It's really hard to find it, even though he leaves this opening. Rather, he reminds the reader that the pretext of the conquest, this one, was largely religious, which is to say that the spread of Christianity was offered as the main justification for the conquest. And more on that in a second. Montesquieu also says forthrightly that the different habits of the Americans, including tobacco use, engendered prejudices in the conquerors that resulted in the failure to apply the right of humanity to the conquered. Perhaps this shouldn't be a surprise, according to Montesquieu, given the fact that the injunction against enslavement as a right of war was a product of wars between Christian and non-Christians in the first place. So he doesn't even give that to Christianity. He points out that that came about when Christians started to come into contact with Islamic nations. So it became, we don't enslave other Christian nations, which is to say we can enslave enemies who are more profoundly enemies to us. So, the gentling of mores that Christianity might be able to claim on behalf of this curtailing enslavement really just, it's something that applies only to Christians. So enemies or infidels on the one hand, they get punitive stuff thrown at them, and those who must be converted have another problem, or who are treated as less than human. So even a religion that claims to be universal and universally binding makes distinctions based on partisanship, I think is part of the point. And with the conquest of the Americas, Montesquieu reminds the reader that the so-called law of nations, or rules limiting bad acts in the context of war, are often forgotten when the enemy, again, is considered less than human. And religion, which I have just mentioned, and which Montesquieu sometimes praises for its good effects, can sometimes add a certain righteous indignation. In a chapter that Montesquieu entitles Another Origin of the Right of Slavery, in Book 15, he spells out the consequences of a proselytizing state when it's in that sort of war. He says, I would as soon say that religion gives to those who profess it a right to reduce to servitude to those who do not profess it in order to work more easily for its propagation. It was this way of thinking that encouraged the destroyers of America in their crimes. On this, they founded the right of making so many people slaves. For these brigands, who absolutely wanted to be both brigands and Christians, were very devout. In the same chapter, Montesquieu also relates how Louis XIII, so he doesn't let the French off the hook, how his bad conscience regarding the moral stain of enslaving Africans in French colonies was alleviated upon justifying the enslavement as a means to conversion. Enslavement is outlawed unless the enemy isn't Christian or in an effort to bring Christianity to the uninitiated, it seems. But Montesquieu arguably still leaves open the possibility of a good conquest and one that in fact provides an improvement. Still, because he says here somehow these people were not being truly Christian in the practices that they maintained. And he provides even more, again, though it's hard to find an occurrence of this, and he traces the very origins of one of the most important documents associated with the law of nations to the bosom of Christianized Roman Empire, and he doesn't have anything nice to say about it. Authorship of this document or compilation of documents and practices is attributed to Emperor Justinian, if you've heard of him, and his work is the Digest. It was an attempt to codify and universalize the practice of imperial Rome's interactions with non-Romans in their domain, and they considered the world their domain for the most part. Often treated as the cornerstone of civilized international intercourse and a major influence on the likes of Grotius and others who established modern international right, Montesquieu criticizes Justinian's proclivity towards change and reform. He criticizes his effort in a similar manner to his complaints of the later Roman or Byzantine Empire. It forgot what made the empire great and became more interested in religious purity than in the military virtues that made Rome incredibly successful. It's actually amazing, this book on Rome, in that he isn't, he doesn't entirely say all empire is terrible, and in fact Judges has a lot of good-ish sort of things to say about the earlier Roman Empire, but the late Roman Empire has nothing good to say for itself. And the greatest fault of the Digest, again, widely referred to by all people who in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries who were establishing international right. But the greatest fault of the Digest is the intolerance that it mandated, as contrasted to prior Roman practices. Let me show you that. This is what he has to say about it. Just as the old Romans strengthened their empire by permitting every kind of religion in it, so it subsequently reduced to nothing by amputating one after the other the sects which were not dominant. Justinian believed he had increased the number of faithful, he had only diminished the number of men. This is in direct contrast to how the pagan Romans handled the empire. As you can see, they didn't engage in the folly of trying to give their laws and customs to all who were conquered. Rather, they just cared that they were obeyed. No matter what laws were being obeyed, as long as they were obeyed, it worked for them. He says this in Considerations. He says this in Spirit of Laws. I hope you remember back to Montesquieu's list of the ways in which conquerors treat conquered. Remember, there are those who leave the laws intact and all the way down to exterminating. So the early Romans did what? The first thing. So it was they who did the right thing in terms of how to conquer, because they were not moved to proselytize, they were not moved to make them Romans, they were just moved to have more of an empire and to have it. Now, this is certainly not to say that the Romans didn't occasionally wipe out some peoples that they conquered, but as a matter of course, they were after obedience. So yeah, it was the later Christianized Rome that was obsessed with uniformity and sought to codify universal rules that apply to all. Montesquieu even states that if the Spaniards had followed the example of the pagan Romans in their conquest of Mexico and Peru, and I quote, they would not have been forced to destroy everything in order to preserve everything. So if they followed the pagan Romans, this wouldn't be such a disaster. The belief in one's mission or one's superiority and the superiority of one's ways, civilizing missions, if you will, which claim to improve the lot of the conquered or even to save them, are politically foolish and potentially cruel, according to Montesquieu. And the problem isn't one tradition or one religion, it's the attempt to draw universal or so-called natural rights, one-size-fits-all conclusions. So it's deep, the problem. In Montesquieu's experience and his study of history, these so-called rules were little more than the rationalization or justification of power. The Digest justified the enslavement of non-Christians, as Grotius's work justified Dutch rule of the seas. You know, there's usually a reason, there's usually an empire to protect when you're making these so-called universal rules. Okay, so we finally come to Montezuma, the Aztec leader in whose mouth Montesquieu puts the following statement. This is the relativism that the paper promised. Okay. So here's, and of course, it goes without saying Montezuma didn't say this. This is Montesquieu. This is very much Montesquieu's Montezuma. Here you go, though. There are many local laws in various religions, and when Montezuma persisted in saying that the religion of the Spaniards was good for their country and that of Mexico for his own, he was not saying an absurd thing, because indeed, legislators could not have kept from having regard for what nature had established before them. So interesting, right? So Montesquieu's Montezuma believes that law and religion are inextricably tied to place and time. Or to put it another way, Montesquieu is saying something along the lines that nature is not simply monolithic. The nature of a place leads to specific outgrowths of customs and laws that are irreducible to one so-called universal public law or law of nations. So rather than advocate on behalf of war for the sake of spreading purported civilization, Montesquieu approves of the kind of law of nations, if such exists, that recognizes a variety of laws, or one that might even say that sovereignty, or one might even say the sovereignty of individual nations, although that word is probably a little premature to be used. If we take a quick peek at what he says about the fundamental laws of nature, this conclusion wouldn't be fully a surprise. So if you had the book in front of you, I'm zipping around the book just for a quick second, I promise. Right at the beginning of the work, in a short and very difficult book called Laws in General, because that sounds very easy, he says that the law of nations is by nature founded on the principle that various nations should do to one another in times of peace the most good possible, and in times of war the least ill possible, without harming their true interests. He then goes on to say the object of war is victory, of victory conquest, of conquest preservation. So he doesn't say anything else. This is it. But if you put it together, you know, with all the other pieces that come in the book, and sometimes they kind of bear fruit by looking back after you've had a chance to kind of read his stories along with his points. You come to see, well, it's always maybe been here in the first place. Isn't the point that the nations of the world are in tension with one another, irreducibly so? Now he does conclude, I haven't shown you this, but he does conclude that self-defense is the only good reason for making war. So he sort of stands with that tradition, which we continue to follow. But he has a fairly muscular view of what defending oneself entails, including preemptive war and including total victory, right? So it's not enough to just shove somebody off. If they kind of continue, if there's going to be a problem in 5 or 10 years, he could conceivably actually, on those grounds, permit enslavement. He's very much against having a right to enslavement, but he can envision and does circumstances in which enslavement is necessary. He hopes it's not forever, again, because it wouldn't be a right, it would be a necessity, but until you have genuinely preserved your conquest, as it says there. It's what's necessary that moves him. He doesn't seek to rewrite or correct the tradition of just war theory or the modern natural rights theories that about what's permitted in war. He talks about what's necessary. So that brings me all the way back around to commerce and why it's the correct paradigm given all of these observations, the problems with international war and so forth, and the irreducible conflict among nations. So commerce offers a solution that falls in line with this sort of thinking. We can limit the bad effects of war or the instances in which states pursue it by appealing to their true interests and by convincing rulers that war is not in their interests. That's what's available. That's the logic that might actually work. Or if they pursue war, they should worry about profiting from the effort, which in Montesquieu's view aligns with improving the situation of the conquered rather than ruining them. The Spanish conquest was also supposed to work as a parable in that sense. The economic results of gutting the New World of its silver and gold led to a depreciation of Spanish currency. It was a fool's quest, not a recipe for true enrichment. So that's something he also harps on in other places. Commerce and Montezuma's account for states as permanently plural, representing a multiplicity of laws rather than law writ large. Montesquieu discredits the idea that Rome provided the best police in the world and encouraged and honored commerce. That's a phrase he uses, and something that other people thought and just took for granted. That was sort of the educated point of view in Europe at the time. You learned all about Rome because Rome is really what mattered, and then also try to copy it. If nature is variable enough to require many sorts of laws and even systems of laws and mores, then the ethos of commerce is appropriate to this particularism. Commerce doesn't require trading partners to live under one set of mores or religion or law, as long as contracts are respected, which realistically only happens when interests are mutual. There's a natural recognition of the needs of the trading partner by necessity. On the other hand, international law, so-called, is a particular codification of law that fancies itself universal or merely imposes itself so it will become so. Its delusions of grandeur can come from a good place perhaps, but will always make mistake its own scope and its validity. Montesquieu seems to judge that it's better to have a competitive marketplace of sovereign nations rather than a law that passes itself off as universal, which it cannot be. It can only be particular. So a careful reading of Montesquieu on the question of how to interpret his hopes for peace and modernity leads to this interesting set of conclusions, but also to some questions for us to consider. While he does his best to beguile the censors, it becomes fairly clear that it's commerce rather than religion, the religion of his time, that deserves credit for the possibility of moving beyond the age of conquest or the desire for universal monarchy and with it universal domination. No new Rome would be possible, and if he had his druthers, it would also become undesirable. If I'm right though, he also has this really serious critique of the possibility of anything like the law of nations and the scope it could have to keep nations in check. He is suspicious of civilizing missions and similarly doesn't foresee a world of international norms that favor peace. I mentioned that Montesquieu was particularly taken with English commercial and constitutional practices, and above all, we'll remember that England is driven by the profit motive, but it also jealously guarded its sovereignty and had no truck with international agreements. This is something he actually bothers to say. So it loves commerce, it loves all the stuff, but it stays right out of, which is really how England has always behaved. It has no truck with these sorts of things. It may trade with an enemy, but it'll always be wary of international organizations. All right, let me get on to setting us up for hopefully what will be a little bit of a discussion. Just want to ask this, so having said all of that, like, where does he leave us? Is my interpretation of his account, let's say I'm right, let's go with that. Is it fair to international law or international cooperation? How down he is on it, right? Has he been proven wrong? Has he been proven right? Some realists point out that Europe was at its most interdependent historically when World War I broke out. So commercial interests can't be counted on to prevent war. It's one thing, just one argument. On the other hand, one can point to the somewhat comical failures of something like the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which attempted to outlaw the use of war as a mechanism to resolve disputes among nations. 1928, there were one or two disputes after that, right? In that case, it might show the weakness of international law rather than its oppressive potential when wielded by a hegemon. Yet, post-World War II, arguably international organizations and norms, starting with the UN and the Bretton Woods regime, have provided some stability. Does this prove Montesquieu wrong, or maybe right, if we think that these are largely venues where sovereign states can advocate on behalf of their interests? And on a different track, the last thing I'll leave you with, again, is Montesquieu a little bit too cynical? What about safeguarding the safety of the weak or the oppressed? Should there not be some laws that govern humanitarian expectations and means to enforce them? And I'll leave you with that. Thank you for listening.
Excellent. I'm
going to stop sharing this.
All right. I can share some questions that we have. So I'll read a question here and then I'll publish it for everyone, Andrea. But the first question that we have is, are Montesquieu's theories relevant today with the globalization and trade wars that are occurring between democratic and communist countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what that goes to is is he overly optimistic? What kind of peace is possible within a commercial universe? So we can say now whether, if you're talking about China, right? China is both communist and commercial, and that seems to be a bit of a problem to Montesquieu, because I think he envisions when nations are commercial that they're going to be also kind of internationalist in their demeanor. So I definitely think that he's that he can't answer all of these questions. I think on his behalf, I would say that he wouldn't be surprised that people try to take advantage of the World Trade Organization, and that all those who play by the rules, there will be the bad actor that tries to profit from that. This is by no means a surprise, So he doesn't think if there's a loophole and if their interest not to cooperate, then I think what he would probably, a modern, like contemporary Montesquieu might say, well, then you've got to change the rules of the game or punish the bad actor, because nobody behaves unless they're meant to. But yeah, I think he's kind of saved. His relevance is saved by the fact that the underlying premise here is not sort of goodwill, but interest. So I think we can use his own logic to improve the playing field in such a way that that he still makes sense.
Awesome. Let me do something real quick. I think, yeah, here we go. So our next question is, does Montesquieu underestimate man's selfishness and capacity for evil?
No.
let me get you live. Okay, now you're back live with that question.
Oh, okay, sorry. My answer was no. Yeah, I'd be curious. I don't know. This venue, this question and answer way. Like I don't know. Are we able to get follow-ups if people want to, if they want it?
If people want to send you can tell them to send follow-ups. Absolutely.
I'd be interested to hear a little bit like what brought that question on, because to my mind, I mean, he's have you taught, which of these modern thinkers have you taught? Hobbes? Yeah, he's Hobbes warmed over, so if you think that and I would say this also, that he wouldn't be surprised by China. He wouldn't be surprised by people only doing things because it's in their interest. In fact, that's the plan. But I forgot the second part of what I was going to say. It's weird being in one's own office and trying to remember everything. But gosh, what was I going to say? Can you re-ask the question? Yeah, the evil business. Okay, yeah. I remember now. But I will say this, things have changed. I wouldn't say that there's been sort of progress in mores or any. And again, remember, he doesn't really think that there's going to be that. But in some ways, I mean, do we really dispute that there's been a kind of gentling of mores to the degree that we don't consider war the most worthwhile activity to undertake? Warmongering, I mean, is not the favorite profession of all kind of ambitious individuals. Like, ambitious individuals will go to Silicon Valley, right? They won't necessarily try to become warriors. And there are very few world leaders for quite some time now who are going to sit and make a speech about how they are going to pursue universal monarchy, right? What they'll actually do now is try to dance around self-defense, right? Like, it is what is it? Russia. It is self-defense for us to take over the Ukraine. Oh, in that case, they just said it was Russian. But like these crazy ideas about what defense would logically need. But if you think about it, right? I mean, no one's willing. The fact that nobody's willing to go out and say that they're going to be aggressive and they are going to, pursue empire, means something has shifted. And I'm not saying that people are nicer necessarily, but war is at a little bit less of a premium, and the kinds of virtues that go along with a kind of aristocratic warmongering do seem to have lowered, and commercial virtues seem to be a little bit more pacific. So I would say he was on to something there.
Wonderful. Our next question is, could this be considered cherry picking? How the ancient Romans acted toward foreign groups? If the Republic age, we saw much more conquest of people who were closer in culture, like the Greeks, but they would wipe out any that they deemed too different, such as Carthage. So the base of the question is there some cherry picking here with regards to how the Romans acted with foreigners? Were they maybe not exactly as Montesquieu described it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important question. I couched my comments a little bit, but probably but I think you're exactly right. Whoever asked that good question. What's the name of the person who asked that question?
Anonymous.
Oh, okay. Anonymous. Got it. So yes, I think that's right. And yes, I think they probably destroyed as many people as they didn't destroy. Carthage, I would I guess dispute some of what you said, in the sense that that wasn't you guys are so different problem. It was you guys are so tough problem. The Punic Wars were rough, right? And I mean, I think they destroyed people at that point more to make it too scary to go against them, right? So I think, and Montesquieu, I think Montesquieu talks about the pagan Romans or the early Romans and also like the early imperial Romans in terms of like their strength. They were tough, they were strong. He doesn't give like a romantic account of them either. Like it's pretty clear, like, they're Gauls, but they're Romans, they're just rough and ready, and but they were really, really, really good at war. And they didn't, and they did all of the things necessary to make the empire bigger and better, and sometimes that required extermination and sometimes it didn't. And so I think the really important distinction between that and what he criticizes later is this idea that, they wanted to propagate a particular religion. That was the issue. They became intolerant, so I would argue that the Carthage issue was not intolerance.
Wonderful. Wonderful. The next question comes from one of our students here who is in our international relations class. And Jalen asks, what framework would you more than likely categorize Montesquieu's theories under? What framework, if we use these traditional, post World War II traditional ideas of frameworks, would you put Montesquieu under?
So that's a piece I published before. So my answer, my considered answer is he's a realist, like period, point blank. But he also, I think, helps articulate why those traditional post-World War II categories are problematic, and why they're limited. Because, I think if you asked a person with more of an IR background, they would say, well, he falls into a liberal category because he's saying commerce makes gentler mores. That sounds pretty darn liberal. He's looking at progress and people are nicer. So, my argument is that he kind of collapses that distinction. I mean, I would even possibly throw in constructivism just for fun, because it matters what point of view, it matters what the ethos is, it matters, what people say about even this, like these civilizing missions and so forth, that could be considered, the kind of the rhetoric and the narrative around what people are doing. And he can conceive of a kind of ancien regime, monarchic kind of honor-loving ethos, and that can be deconstructed and changed, pretty radically by the rise of a different kind of class. That's like a social constructivist sort of. So I think those categories are limited in their usefulness, and I think he helps us see that. But if I absolutely had to choose, it would be realism.
I feel like that could be a really bad IR theory game. Like, choose one, marry one, right? Get rid of one, right? Like, what do you do with these frameworks?
Can you make me live?
Yeah.
I'm trying to trick the system into having a conversation. Just as a personal anecdote, and I guess the good thing is, since I can't see anybody, I don't know if anybody's interested, but I can pretend. So I started off in IR as an undergrad. When I started in political science, I also took a jaunt into literature. But I mean, when I started in political science, I was doing IR, and I remember learning the realism and liberalism and all that. And I couldn't, from the beginning, I was like, but wait a minute, what if it's this and this at the same time? And then I took intro to political philosophy, and I was immediately allowed to transgress these paradigmatic, little boxes, and I was so pleased. So that's why I went this way. Sorry, go on.
No, I appreciate that. That's a little plug for theory classes there. We let you have some fun going outside the box. Another question here comes from Aaron, who asks, where do you see Montesquieu's position on what we term as human rights violations in international affairs? Would the Aztecs' human sacrifices to their gods constitute a space for commerce to do its work to smooth those mores? Or would that be something that could be not tolerated? And he thanks you all for the interesting discussion here.
Wait, before you turn it, oh, sorry.
Yep. I can repeat though here.
Can you repeat the second part? I started to formulate my answer, and then I think I missed something important about the second part.
So with regards to the second part, would the Aztec human sacrifices to their gods constitute a space for commerce to do its work, to smooth those mores, or would that be something that could not be tolerated?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Also, I really enjoy that. So there is one example that I am aware of in the spirit of the laws where he does say that a practice was improved by a conqueror, and that was Alexander the Great when he took over Bactria, which I barely know where that is. And I think that the practice was that they fed their elders to dogs. So he put an end to that. And he has very nice things to say about Alexander. He grossly exaggerates, like just like Montezuma becomes Montesquieu's Montezuma, Alexander very much becomes Montesquieu's Alexander, but he wants to demonstrate, if you're going to be, an old-fashioned conqueror, the right way to do that. So I think he means, so when he says this thing that you can't say now and you would not be able to say now, that some conquests do people some good. he generally doesn't mean it, and he generally thinks it's a crock. But there are instances where that is the case. Like there are cases where you've got a really ineffectual government, and sometimes you get taken over because somebody is leading very poorly. So maybe you get yourself a better ruler. Now, so in terms of the, there's actually John Rawls talks about Montezuma also in a work called the law, that he calls the Law of Nations, I think he calls it that, and he talks about Montezuma, and he talks about Aztec sacrifice, and like their sort of their traditions. Like I don't vouch for whether this is how things went down. I don't know, but he speaks to that and wonders if there needs to be toleration for the different points of view. How far are you going to take this kind of particularism, right? You do your thing, we're going to do our thing, right? Are there such things as like incredibly like offensive things like feeding your elders to dogs? Is there some sort of universal point of view, at least there, where you can do that? I think so. I think this is Montesquieu's answer to my mind. I think he thinks I think he doesn't think well of a lot of, he's not a fan of most religious practices. He thinks, especially ones that have to do with sacrifice or cruelty or anything like that. He thinks there's the potential for a lot of fanaticism, and he's not a big fan of that. I think he thinks that commerce naturally breaks down those sorts of sentiments. He thinks it's just a natural progression. So basically what he counts on is a kind of secularism that is likely to arise as commercialism also kind of as it sort of floods the world. You're going to have more McDonald's, and you're not going to have as much religion. There's a reason that non-commercial nations traditionally, and probably now, shut themselves off to the outside world, right? Why does China not allow, the internet to come in? Why are, just on and on, right? They're open societies and more closed societies, right? The more open the society, and he makes in those kind of comments about commerce, the more you kind of trade opinions, the more you see the way other things work, the less likely you're to choose the stuff that hurts. And the more your belly is full, and the more you can turn on like the Britney Spears documentary and chill out to your cheddar puffs. Not that I did this recently. The less likely you are to want to sacrifice children to the sun god in the morning. And finally, because this is apparently I like to talk about this topic, but the there's a small work he did in French that isn't translated that is all about how Pizarro and Cortez, the two main conquistadores that took over the Aztecs and the Inca, how they got lucky, because they shouldn't have won. The reason they won is because the native populations at the time were operating under metaphysical errors, by which he meant that they took them to be gods. So if they had understood their own material superiority at that point, and he said if they had only read Descartes, then the conquista would have been a failure. So he thinks so commerce doesn't live together with destructive prejudices, and those can be a lot of different things, and they tend to be sort of fanatical belief systems.
Wonderful. Just an observation we have from the Q&A too about this discussion here. One of our Professor Emeriti in the department and former member of Congress, Dr. Browder, says, not a question, but just an observation, that he notes the commonality here of sentiments between Montesquieu's reference to Montezuma's emphasis on the mores of his homeland and President Biden's recent comments acknowledging the norms of China and China's norms, given the current situations and tensions there. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to just try to maybe get one or two more questions in here with Dr. Radasanu before we're out of time. We have a question here from a former student who's currently in law school for her. He asked, how would Montesquieu look at the rise of proxy wars between powers using minor factions? And he's thinking maybe about Vietnam or something about in the Middle East right now. But would Montesquieu have anything there with regards to commerce and gently of mores with regards to these proxy wars that are happening?
I'm not sure how helpful he could be on those sorts of things. I think one question that I've heard asked about him that kind of comes a little closer historically to this question, I think that you're asking is, colonies, and wars that like in the 18th century already, but then in the 19th century, I mean, a lot of the European wars were happening about the colonies, and sometimes proxy wars in the colonies. It would, like the War of 1812, one example. But I think the way I've heard it asked and the way I think about that question too is that maybe that's where he underestimates the potential for generating more wars, as a result, commerce not being simply pacifying, but, the more that you try to capture markets and so forth, the more you're going to have those problems. But I think if he had a chance to hang out for another couple of decades and hang out with Adam Smith, for example, I think he probably would have said, well, it's probably just not a good idea to do that. It's better to just have more free trade. I think if we're talking about proxy wars too that are more Cold War related, I think he would point to the destructive prejudice of communism, probably, if he had an opportunity to do so. And then, because if there are wars that were unnecessary, he wouldn't be in favor of it. As far as like just having factions and proxy wars, I think that's just probably war, so to a degree it probably is unavoidable.
Wonderful. Focusing here still on war and commerce, we have another student asking, what would Montesquieu say when commerce fails to detour conflict? For example, what would he say regarding the 1941 oil embargo the United States placed on Imperial Japan?
Commerce is not going to magically make people, fully peaceable and nice to one another. It's just the best mechanism possible. He wants there to be reasons to overcome. I mean, if there's enough money involved, I think his premise is that you're not going to care about your, your prejudices about a person. Sure, commerce is going. I think if I can speak for Montesquieu, long dead. I mean, he can't correct me, so there's that. But again, I think the basic response is it's not surprising that it doesn't always work. You know, and also, like, you know, in that case, what was this war about, right? I mean, I think he'd also criticize it based on, you know, this is what happens when people start with their, in this case, not religious, maybe they're secular, nationalistic bits. I think one thing one can respond to him and perhaps others, you know, of his ilk from the same generation of writers is, hey, Montesquieu, are you sure that people are fundamentally reasonable and amenable to doing what's in their interest? You know, are you sure that you can get rid of destructive prejudices, or will they always come about in, you know, new and exciting ways?
Wonderful, thank you. It looks like this could be our last question, and it's from one Lewis Haas. I'll do my best. It's a novel here, but he writes, Montesquieu's criticism of the modern philosophers of public right is strange in the precise reasons for which he criticizes them. It's not that modern philosophers are wrong in justifying the destruction of societies, but the tethering of this principle to the destruction of men. This seems to suggest that an international law that allows for the destruction of society, if not men, or an extermination of the citizen that still preserves the men. This seems to contradict further his previous statement that modern conquerors leave the laws and customs of the conquerors intact. By this reasoning, the conquistadors may very well have been justified in their aim to undermine the societies of the New World and substitute a new spirit in those peoples, at least in theory, if not in actual history. This also seems to leave open a realm of the possibility of humanitarian, civilizing, or democratizing wars, despite the misgiving elsewhere. The destruction of societies that do not conform to modern principles that stop short at enslavement or extermination of individuals. That is to say, the limits of Montesquieu's international law lie precisely along the contours that separate enlightened modernity from its detractors. I suppose what I'm getting at is, are Montesquieu's principles of war and conquest themselves any less a justification for the pursuit of a kind of power, if only the soft power of his modern ideals?
Probably not. Yeah, I'd have to, Lewis, I'd have to study this a little bit more to give you like a better, I think the first part of what you said is the part that I would have the biggest problem just agreeing with, but I think if I'm correct, the thrust of this is he's not a guy who seems to actually care that the laws of people are going to be disrupted as a result of this. So it's not that he has a right of conquest where he's privileging that you know, the conquered maintain their way of life. So if that's the crux of it, I think that's right, and I think that's right that it's not you know, the international law, that he's not mad at Grotius for being hypocritical, really, or anything along those lines. So yeah, I don't think he's like self-determination. I think when you try to make him into a guy who cares about self-determination, the way that came to be an issue, you know, especially in the 19th century, I think you're right that isn't his shtick, right? It's that you know, yes, the Spaniards could have gone in there, and if they had just wanted to trade, and they would have, and the locals would have simply changed their ways as a result of the interaction with Europe, that he has no particular problem with. So yeah, ruining things over a long period of time is fine, as long as you're not, you know, you're not ruining the person, as you say, but if you're ruining the citizen and the way of life, I don't think that that's something he fundamentally has a problem with. So I hope I captured, I hope I understood the basis of the question.
I want to thank Dr. Radasanu, Dr. Andrea Radasanu, for joining us tonight for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure you guys will all join me at home or wherever you're at watching, but join in a round of applause. It was very enlightening, not being punny by any means, but it was a very enlightening presentation and a wonderful examination into really the complexities, once again, of Montesquieu and the complexities of political theory that allow you to transcend some of those boxes that we see in IR. And so I really appreciate her joining us here tonight. I should say, ask Andrea, is there anything else that you want to say?
I just.
Oh, hold on. Let me get you brought back in here. I apologize. You gotta love tech there a bit. It's not the most nimble, but let me bring her right back in here.
I just wanted to thank you very much. I really appreciate the lively questions. I hope I didn't speak too long and curtail some of those questions, but I really appreciated the opportunity to meet with everybody today. And Ben, thanks again for having me.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure. Let me get my. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. I appreciate you coming. Well, you know, once we get this under control, we'll have to get you down here to actually come visit us in person. We'd love to have you come visit and help us more. Just thank you again to the Jack Miller Center for their generous grant for supporting the Tocqueville Lecture Series here. Keep up to date with us. Follow us on our Facebook page where we keep updates. And also, so you know, our next lecture will be on Thursday, April 22nd, when we'll be hosting Dr. Jeremy Bailey from the University of Houston, who will be presenting on his recent publication on the idea of presidential representation in intellectual and political history. So please join us again for that, and please follow us on Facebook for more updates. Thank you all again for joining tonight. We hope you have a wonderful and safe night and have a good time thinking and reflecting on these wonderful ideas as we leave today. Have a good night. See you soon. Bye.